Alright, it's time to react. WhatIfAltHist's, the best history YouTuber ever. Isn't it like just amazing and also incredibly predictable how he went from like making videos where he just like injects himself full of heroin and then says whatever the comes to mind, where he like tries to like spin like a pro-Western far-right narrative about literally anything he possibly can, while just putting like a random map on the screen. Now he's making videos about like why modern dating is broken, how family structure drives ideology. He goes from like making videos about how women caused the fall of the Roman Empire to why can't I get a girlfriend? I don't know, dude, maybe there's a correlation between those two things. Anyway, I think he has a video about Latin America, and that's what we need to fucking see here. That's what we need to see. What it gets to the bottom of here, though, is... So, obviously, his politics are worse than Kraut somehow. But is his history worse than Kraut? Like, is he better at making shit up than Kraut? Or does he at least try to somewhat ground what he's saying in some sort of reality so that it's more persuasive? That's what I want to sort of examine here. Getting into the What If Alternate History video. That isn't actually a channel about alternate history at all. It's actually a channel about like how like anything that isn't like as like far right and traditional as possible is bad. Anything that isn't like free market capitalism is bad. And why don't I have a girlfriend? All mixed into one. So let's find out. Let's understand Latin America.
Latin America is one of the most forgotten, ignored regions in the world.
What? Okay, we're starting off with probably the dumbest claim I've ever seen. One of the most forgotten and ignored... No, that's just... You're kind of mistaking your ignorance as like a random white American who's never left his home state with that of everyone else. Right? Don't confuse yourself for the entire world, because that is just a fucking bonkers statement. Like Jesus.
It's not as wealthy or powerful enough to be Europe or the US, it hasn't seen Asia's dynamic growth, and it's not as war-ridden or desperately poor as Africa is. This means that Latin America generally gets left behind in books on politics or history.
What?
I can't tell you how many politics books I've read that just look at Asia and Europe and the US.
What politics books? What the fuck are you reading? What the hell? Like, yeah, if you're reading like generic like pop history garbage from the New York Times bestseller list, of course it's going to focus on the US and Europe and Western countries or whatever, and maybe like throw in a reference to Japan once or twice. But like the idea that it's like no one pays attention to it, dude, that's says a whole lot more about the shit that you consume than anything actually objective.
US, or history books that just cover the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and Incas and then promptly forget the region existed at all. People from the Eastern Hemisphere generally forget Latin America or view it as quaint, while Canadians and Americans often look upon it with a combination of horror and condescension. This video is my attempt to explain how Latin America works. It'll look at how Latin America formed, how it's progressed, and where it's going. Let's look at one of the most enigmatic and confusing parts of the world, a region of dazzling diversity and color stretching from Miami to
Miami. Oh god, that's insulting. I don't want Miami to be a part of it.
the Arctic.
Welcome to WhatIfAltHist's. He doesn't actually ask any questions about alternate history at all. Oh, look at this fucking sick music. How does Latin America work? Like, what the fuck kind of a question is that even? How does Latin America work? That's not even a question that's possible to dissect, because it's just incoherent. It's like asking, how does Asia work? Like, what the fuck? Work in what respects? And Latin America, like, as something taken all together? Like, what the fuck does that mean? We're starting off really fucking strong here.
Civilizations take millennia to build and have a great deal of struggle and adventure that go into them. Experience some of that with Rise of Kingdoms.
Oh! Oh my god. The video isn't even serious. Just a front to somehow form a random link with a fucking mobile phone cash shop gambling game. I love it. Oh, it's incredible.
Use the gift code to claim in-game props.
Use the
also
gift
participate
code.
in a contest to win an iPhone.
Use the gift code YPride1488.
In the first video in this series in which I talked about Western civilization, I left Latin America out of that video, which turned out to be a controversial decision in which people...
Like, we all know why you left it out, because it goes against, like, you know, you can't have a place colonized by the whites that I don't want to use as my exemplar.
People keep on asking me why I made that call. The truth is, I don't know or care if Latin America is part of Western civilization. It's sort of like as
You don't know or care about it. That's why you make videos like lionizing the concept of Western civilization all the time.
turquoise a shade of green or blue. I'm sure some person has a definite answer to that question somewhere, but the only thing I can tell you is that the colors green and blue exist, and there's an area in between that's also a color, and I don't think arguing over whether or not it's blue or green is worthwhile. Latin America does have certain aspects of Western civilization and certain that don't fit, but I find arguing over definitions definitions takes away from actually looking at things for what they really are by shoving them into pre-existing frameworks. The point I was trying to make is that Latin America is complex and
Latin America DLC. We need to shut down map video games until we can figure out what's going on. Of fucking course this guy is a product of playing map video games. I'm intentionally saying map, right? Because it has a double meaning. He's a minor attracted person and he also plays video games that are literal maps. I guarantee you, this guy learned everything he knows about the world by playing fucking Paradox video games. Latin American DLC, necessary additions, native peoples, I guess we don't have those anywhere else. Juntas, like no one in Latin America uses that word. There were like unified military dictatorships in like 5 countries for like a 20-year period maybe. So that doesn't make any sense at all to even throw that out. And every single one of them was only installed as a result of America. I'm sure that will be left out. Like putting that in there like it's somehow like some sort of cultural like quirk, like core part of a civilization or something, that is a bit suspect, my friend. Regular hyperinflation. So I mean, you know, Americans will call anything hyperinflation, also ignoring how they caused it. Rolling political fashions. What the fuck does that mean? Far greater geographic diversity. That one, especially in comparison to the US, makes no sense at all. The US is just as geographically diverse. All I'm saying is that Latin America is a whole different video game from Germany or Canada. A whole different video game. Dude, you seriously need to get a grip on reality. This is not okay, whatever the fuck this is.
Different enough from the rest of Western civilization that it deserves a video in of itself to explain it. The US operates similarly enough to Germany that you could use the same basic operating system on both. Meanwhile,
what in the fucking hell are you saying?
Well, you would need to code a completely different expansion pack in order to model how, say, Colombia works.
How the fuck do we even respond to that? That is just nonsensical. What the fuck is this man saying? What the hell is going through his insane brain? Obviously, you can't answer that because he's not going to elaborate on it. He's just going to toss it out there and leave you to fucking deal with the ruins of that just downright bizarre statement that he just made.
You might say Argentina or Uruguay are similar enough to what southern Italy would be like as an independent country, or Portugal, and that's probably fair.
What? Dude, like, I can't... it's hard to respond to any of the shit that he's saying because he doesn't elaborate. He just makes these wild, insane statements and then, like, acts like that's all he needs to say. Like, he doesn't need to provide any examples, any, like, actual proof for what he's saying, like, any explanation of why he's saying it. He just says it, and he goes. Like, how do you even respond to that?
Thing is, the Philippines could reasonably be considered a cultural part of Latin America, given that it was colonized by the Spanish for centuries during the same era as Latin America. I mean, the Philippines are named after the 16th century King Philip of Spain, for Christ's sake. Similarly, the native peoples were tribal farmers at a similar level.
It might be a bit of an issue of this thesis, you know, that the Philippines, they're just not in America. Like, the definition of Latin America is not country colonized by Spain.
Development to roughly Colombia. I could probably make a fascinating video using the Philippines to understand Latin America, but the Philippines is sadly...
There are similar looking buildings. Okay, well, go to the city center of Buenos Aires. It looks exactly like Paris. Literally exactly the same. Okay, I guess that means Argentina is actually a francophone country, right? That's how this works?
One of the areas of the world where I know the least history about. There are generally 3 continental cultural influences in Latin America. The Iberian in the form of the Spanish and Portuguese, the African and native populations. Every Latin American country has these influences to differing degrees, with some nearly entirely missing out in the native or African influence, but...
And apparently, like, every single group of Indian people is the exact same. Every single group of African people is the exact same. But the Europeans, they get to actually be divided, right? They get to actually be clarified. Iberian. That same courtesy is not applied to American peoples, nor is it applied to African peoples. They are all just a blob. Classic stuff here.
With Iberian culture being the shared characteristic. How these formed is the topic of the next part of this video. The Spanish conquest of the New World was really impressive in sheer military terms. In many cases, like Pizarro's conquest of the Inca, 200 or so Spaniards, with the overlooked help of native allies, were able to conquer an empire of 11 million people.
He's like, it was really impressive in sheer military terms. He mentions the native allies without mentioning how many of them there were and how they are kind of outnumbered the Spaniards by like 100 to 1. So in sheer military terms, it actually wasn't impressive at all, because in sheer military terms, they often had even or more in terms of pure numbers than their opponents did. So in pure military terms, it was not very impressive at all. You could say perhaps in like diplomatic terms, because they did a lot of maneuvering, but also in pure luck terms, they did very well. It was a series of incredibly improbable events in which they got incredibly lucky. An alternate history channel could make a video, if it was a good one, about how incredibly lucky they were and how it basically could never have happened if those events played out again. But yeah, I mean, right off the bat, we're getting some Jared Diamond shit here.
600 Spaniards under Cortez were able to conquer the Aztec Empire, which had roughly the same population as France's of downwards of 20 million people.
So, right, it's framed as 600. Yeah, 600 Spaniards. And how many people were fighting alongside them from native groups? A whole lot more than 600 who were just not mentioned. So in order to make it sound impressive, you have to erase the actual facts of what happened. Classic Europoid stuff here.
Poland, whose capital at Tenochtitlan would be the second biggest city in Europe.
Yeah, this is just generic European supremacist narrative where the fact that they didn't actually do even like 10% of the actual fighting is erased in order to frame the Europeans as like racially superior superhumans. That's how it works.
A couple things allowed this, the first of which is the obvious technological advantages. Much to many people's surprise, the biggest Spanish advantages weren't with guns, but with steel and especially horses, which the native fighting styles were in no way adapted for. However, another very important...
Again, just plainly untrue. Like, if you're going to try and say that like a few dozen to a couple hundred horses were more important to the actual victories in battle than the 10,000 native peoples fighting alongside them, you're just being completely fucking insane. It's that simple.
Factor was that these native regimes were often really brutal and disliked. Although later Latin American nationalist historians have tried to rehabilitate them, the Aztec...
Latin American nationalist historians? You're literally engaging in rehabilitation of the Spanish Empire right now, my dude.
Empire, for example, was really hated since it was the New World equivalent of Assyria, which used immense brutality to hold down its subject peoples, and the Inca...
I mean, the Spanish replaced them and were even worse. So... like, where is he trying to go with this?
Though being generally fairly benevolent, expanded too quickly and were already suffering crippling civil wars when the Spanish arrived. The Spanish native allies often numbered 90% of their manpower. Similarly, disease was probably the biggest factor.
Like, how does he reconcile throwing that in there, like, as a passing comment, while still trying to frame the conquests as, like, something that was incredibly impressive in military terms? It just wasn't impressive in military terms then.
Killing 90% of the native population, which had no immunity to European diseases within a century of European arrival. One of the things you need to understand at the Spanish colonization of Latin America was that it was in many ways an extension of the Reconquista, or the process by which the North Christian Spanish kingdoms colonized the South Muslim ones. It's a little ironic that the last Muslim kingdom in Spain was crushed in the same year as the discovery of the New World by Columbus. This manifests in a bunch of ways. First of all, for a lot of the wars with the Muslims, the Spanish would gather local ambitious militias together to conquer the Muslim cities without much guidance from the centralized government. These enterprising captains would turn power over to the central Castilian monarchy in exchange for titles of nobility. This was exactly the way in which the Spanish colonized the New World, with the conquistadors acting out of their own free will and acting like private business endeavors. The central Castilian government accumulated this massive New World empire without...
They didn't actually end up giving them titles of nobility, though. For one, at least not in the New World, they certainly didn't. And for two, framing it as like private business endeavors is a bit misleading, considering they were, in most cases, literally contracted and entirely funded by the Spanish crown, which is, you know, exactly how, at that time, like any government operated. They paid people to undergo military campaigns for them. It's not like they were forced to do it, at least not most of the time. Columbus, for example, like the very first example of this, you know, he pitched an idea to the crown and they paid him to do it. It's really not that much different from, you know, simply having a professional army.
Without real effort on their part. It's sort of like if Elon Musk colonized Mars with SpaceX.
Holy shit, he is literally, oh my god, this guy is insufferable.
And used his own money. And
yeah, he's trying to frame it as like, isn't capitalism great?
Then turns it over to the US government.
No, they didn't use their own money. They were fucking literally paid and supervised by the Spanish monarchy. That's not what happened. Like, he's trying to frame it as like a great success of free market capitalism, just like Elon Musk. Imagine if Elon Musk, man, this didn't age fucking well, did it? This did not age well at all. Holy shit.
The largest way the Reconquista played into the creation of Latin America was sheerly through the immense energy and conviction that was done with. While most of Europe was in the Renaissance era of humanism, of painting naked people and borderline atheism, Spain was still hardcore crusader. The reason people like...
What? No, that's just not wrong. That's just literally completely fucking wrong. What the hell are you talking about? They were all incredibly fucking religious at this time. Like, I mean, 100, 200 years later, England was fighting a fucking religious war every 20 years amongst themselves. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Cortez or Pizarro didn't declare themselves independent kings upon conquering their massive empires. Was
that they couldn't have, because the Spanish would have sent others after them and just fucking massacred them all.
Belief in the mission of a united Spain that came from the centuries-long conflict with the Muslims.
I don't know, these people actually, like Cortez and Pizarro, prove themselves to be incredibly self-centered and motivated by greed a million times over, but he's just offhandedly saying it's because they were loyal to the idea of Spain. They didn't have the power to do that at all. Especially because the entire basis of their alliances with native people, which is what allowed them to win these military conflicts in the first place entirely, and which is what the supposed power that they had depended on. These alliances depended on them telling the people that they were the representatives of a powerful, important foreign monarch. That's the only reason why they even allied with them in the first place. So do you think if they were like, oh, actually, we're declaring ourselves to be your king now, the natives would have just fucking turned on them and fucking speared them immediately? This doesn't make any sense at all.
The Spanish did best in the pre-existingly developed kingdoms in the New World like the Aztecs or Inca. These empires were similar to those of the Bronze Age in the Old World, with highly centralized god-king structures. The Inca Empire, for example, was one of the very few successful communist states in history, with no—
What? I'm in awe. How do you respond to that? I'm in absolute fucking awe.
Private property, everyone being assigned jobs, and the state even assigning brides. The centralized kingdoms provided a central nexus that the Spaniards could easily base their power out of. For example, in Peru, the Spaniards easily first enslaved and then serfed the native population. They just used the governmental structures set up by the Inca to oppress the native peasantry even more. In many circumstances, the Spanish used the native aristocracies, who they recognized as legitimate nobility, to govern their empires. The conquistadors also married into the pre-existing Indian nobility at a really high rate in order to maintain their local legitimacy. All of this meant that the centers of Spanish America were also the native centers in thus Mexico and Peru. It's often shocking that the Spaniards were able to control such massive—
I'm so shocked from the previous revelation that I'm unable to say or process anything that's being said right now.
Realms so outnumbered, but you have to remember that the Spanish annihilated the pre-existing cultural leadership by wiping out the indigenous priest classes, who were the teachers, historians, bankers, and community—
This is just insane shit. And look at these fucking pictures. What is this? It's literally you have to remember that every single group of people in the Americas was exactly the same. All of them had the priest class, that they were the special boys, and once they were gone, there was nothing left. It was all over.
Leaders of these societies. Similarly, the Spanish argument was that their god was superior, and that was very heavily backed by the natives dying at 90% rates to disease. With their belief in their own cultures and leadership neutered, the Indians of the urban societies in the New World became quite
There were relatively few urban centers, just like in Europe at the time. Of the urban societies in the New World. So what, people from fucking Tenochtitlan? That's it. That's not really enough, especially— it doesn't really make any sense either, especially since the allies they had generally came from other places. The idea that they prove their god was superior via epidemics of disease, rather than the fact that they enslaved people en masse and forcibly converted them under the threat of death. That's kind of a pretty important factor as well, don't you think?
Subservient subject of the Spanish crown. The non-profitable areas were generally—
they literally made having the basic right to not be murdered on the spot tied to being Christian.
Colonized by the church. Conquistadors wanted to become lords with serfs, but lost interest in the areas where that got difficult.
Pretty much all of them were anyway.
Others just wanted converts, and it was nice if they got serfs as well, but that wasn't strictly necessary. On the mosquito-ravaged coasts of Venezuela, the deserts of Texas or California, or the grasslands of Paraguay, Spanish civilization was largely brought by the church. Brazil and Argentina—
Spanish civilization was brought by the church to Florida? There are a few things as failed as the Spanish supposed colonies of North America. They managed to accomplish next to nothing there.
Are largely the exceptions to this. In Brazil, which we'll investigate in more detail, the Portuguese started using it as a way station to sail on their way to the Indian Ocean. Both Argentina and Brazil were settler societies in the mold of the US and Canada, inhabited either by African slaves or white settlers with little—
They predated the US and Canada. What?
Brazil, which we'll investigate in more detail, the Portuguese started using it as a way station to sail on their way to the Indian Ocean. Both Argentina and Brazil were settler societies in the mold of the US and Canada.
Settler societies, sure, but not in the mold of the US and Canada, because for one, they predated the US and Canada, and for two, they were structured completely differently, with a generally intermarrying into aristocracy that ruled over largely native borderline serfs / African slaves, which, that's not that different to the US, but generally in the US, landholdings were not quite as concentrated, because in the Spanish Americas, it wasn't as simple of a matter as coming over and just buying land from someone. It was more of a blood inherited aristocratic sort of thing. Much more similar to feudalism.
Inhabited either by African slaves or white settlers with little Indian influence.
Aside from most of the people who worked for them, or at least a hugely significant portion, not so much in Brazil, but certainly in Argentina, who were absolutely mostly descended from natives. Just like, I guess they didn't exist though.
The Spanish crown had a social structure with three main power centers with one supreme over the rest, those being the landlords, church, and crown. The landowners were largely the descendants of the conquistadors. In most Latin American countries until around the 1970s, around 12 to 15 families controlled the majority of all the land, and thus large parts of the economy.
Did you just say 12 families controlled all of the land in Latin America? I mean, maybe you can make an argument that in like a specific country, 12 families controlled a lot of the land. 12 families controlling a majority of the land in all of Latin America? That is a fucking bold. It's a very bold claim. It's a very specific claim as well. It's one that you would think someone would source. And what he actually cites on the screen is nothing like that. 3% of the population controlled 55% of the farmland. Yeah, sure. That's a lot different to what you said out loud, though.
The Spanish crown gave massive tracts of land to a new nobility with serfs in exchange for converting them to Christianity. The church, given lots of land and tremendous amounts of power by a very Catholic society that had just defeated the Muslims, became a huge force in Spanish America. It was basically the cultural nexus that provided the basic welfare, education, art, banking, leadership.
The church didn't become a huge force because of some vague notion of Catholicism or anything. The church became a huge force because the core to the Spanish justifications for every single thing they did was always religion. Without the church, how could they possibly have continued to justify any of the justifications they were using for anything they were doing? It's not so much that the church was below the crown. Honestly, the church and the crown were completely intertwined. The church and the crown were both complementary means of colonialism. It's not like one was below the other.
And investment of the Spanish Empire. The church was the most stable organization in society and was also the thing that the Indians trusted the most. Although the Spanish American church was often brutal and racist, that provided the and investment of the Spanish Empire. The church was the most stable organization in society.
I'm going to alternate between saying Native Americans and American Indians, since Indian is the term in Latin America. No, it's not. Indian is the term in the US only, pretty much. Anywhere else, you'll generally get punched saying that. And American Indians, when polled, have consistently preferred that term. Okay, well, that term is not used for people south of the US. So I don't see how them being polled on that is relevant.
Society, and was also the thing that the Indians trusted the most. Although the Spanish American church was often...
The terminology is confusing it's confusing if you've never heard of any of this shit before. Native American is used pretty much exclusively in the US and Canada. Indian is used pretty much exclusively in the US. In Latin America, you would just use indigenous or in the Spanish term, a Spanish term or Portuguese term, which means original peoples.
Brutal and racist in comparison to the landlords who wanted to enslave the native population.
Why doesn't he just use indigenous? That is the term that encompasses all of them. Why not just use indigenous if you want to include everyone? Why? He's using all of the terms except the easiest one that everyone's okay with. As a rule, the Catholics, like the French, Spanish, and Portuguese, were significantly more humane than the Protestant ones like the British and the Dutch towards the natives. The Catholics wanted converts, while the Protestants wanted to destroy the natives. The Catholics didn't want converts, they wanted labor, okay? That's a big difference there. They wanted people who they could actually enslave or functionally enslave. To frame that as more humane than trying to drive them away or kill them, which they also engage in a lot of, is that's getting towards pretty fucking dangerous territory there. I'm not really sure that engaging in the mass enslavement of people because you want them to be forced to work your farms for the rest of their lives and or pay tribute to you for the rest of their lives is particularly a more moral reasoning than just wanting to take over that land for yourself without them being useful to you. So, this is the white legend sort of narrative that the Spanish nationalists used. We were so much more humane. We just wanted to convert them and show them Christ or whatever, without sort of going over how the entire reason for converting them was so that they could then be made into slaves, or at least serfs. And if they would refuse to be converted, well, then they would definitely be made into slaves.
The church stood up for the rights of the Indians and basic human decency.
The church stood up for the rights of the Indians and basic human decency. Never have I heard a more bullshit phrase. Isolated individual members associated with the church certainly did, but the church did. You can count them on one fucking hand. The church? Whenever there was a group of Jesuits who actually tried to treat natives like human beings, the church would fucking reprimand them. The church was completely core to the structure of Spanish colonialism in South America, and it wasn't because they were benevolent, it was because they were the exact opposite. The church was literally the institution that ruled that enslaving black people was a-okay because they were tainted in their blood. The church was basically at the core of the racial justification for slavery, which was then adopted by the English as well later on. This is so completely wrong that I'm just gobsmacked.
One of the most powerful elements in Spanish America.
It's incredible, the really all-encompassing, very general claims that he makes Like extremely general claims. A claim like the church was at the core of Spanish benevolency or whatever. In order to make that claim, like you need to explain why exactly you think they were benevolent, the Spanish were more benevolent or whatever in the first place. Provide us with some actual examples, then provide us with some justification for the claim that the church was the reason for this, which makes no sense at all if you know about the church's involvement in Spanish colonialism, with examples as well, which you need to provide a whole fucking ton of examples that go down, not just down to the micro level, but to the macro level as well. Like, but he just says it and moves on. It's done. It's one sentence. That's all I need. Jesus.
Society, which was deeply surprising given that the empire was so fucking huge. It would take nearly half a year for orders from the crown to reach a place like Bogota in Colombia, and even longer to reach Manila in the Philippines. Something that's very key to understand at the Spanish Empire is that they were clearly consciously trying to model the Romans. A mistake I read about in a lot of colonial histories is that they view the Spanish colonial officials as idiotic thugs who were purposely trying to impoverish their subjects. That's not accurate. The Spanish officials were actually remarkably well-educated and intelligent, studying Roman law and Greek philosophy at some of the best universities in the world, but their understanding of the world is
so they weren't brutal because they studied at universities.
Very different than ours. The Spanish were the last of the old school empires in Europe. What I mean by that is that before the modern world, most empires were not economically based. Instead, they tried to control their societies through hierarchy. They tried to maintain religious homogeneity in order to maintain social cohesion, centralize power as much as possible in order to maximize their power, try to control trade to support their social hierarchies, and build societies as cohesive, supposedly symbiotic hierarchies rather than maximizing freedom. They all trusted that educated...
What? Maximizing freedom? Is he contrasting like this style of empire with an opposite style of empire that tries to maximize freedom? Like the very notion of an empire of any kind is kind of very much not conducive to maximizing freedom. Where does that come from?
Gentlemen and nobilities would manage a state better than a bunch of rabble. As of the 16th century, this is how every successful empire in a European gentleman's collective consciousness had been maintained across history, whether...
Almost all empires in history, except a couple in the West, believed a system based on hierarchy was the best, and that loyalty through hierarchy and uniformity was better than one operating through financial incentives. Hierarchy and financial incentives are not fucking... at all opposites. In fact, financial incentives are how hierarchy is maintained. How do you fucking think the Spanish nobility maintained their hierarchy? Through financial and material incentives. That was why the people who did what they did for them in the Americas did it, for material incentives. Does he think there's not hierarchy under capitalism? This is absolutely just like straight out of like a fucking mod for a map video game. Jesus.
The Romans, Persians, Chinese, etc. However, starting right after the Spanish Empire formed, new forms of empire were created, those based on financial rather than hierarchical power. People were encouraged to work for the empire through market incentives rather than a social superior telling them to do so. Starting with the Dutch and the British, and then...
That's so fucking bizarre, because he went over like 10 minutes ago how he believed that like the Spanish conquistadors were motivated by an entrepreneurial free market capitalism. And now he's just saying, actually, no, it was the exact opposite.
And taking in the French and reaching an apex with the Americans, empires became structured to maximize outputs and freedom of action so that the society could become as efficient.
And freedom of action? Wow, I would fucking love to see him try to prove his thesis of freedom of action in any of these colonies that he has listed here. Freedom of action. Man, let's go to some Indian dying from famine in 1880 and ask him how his freedom of action is going.
And powerful as possible. I once read a book written in the 1940s saying that Mexico was poor and America rich since the Spanish thought one became wealthy by controlling gold and the English thought it was by making stuff. These market-oriented societies absolutely wrecked hierarchy-based empires like the Spanish, Ottomans, Chinese, etc. as time passed.
I once read a book. Which book? How did it justify this claim? Because that is fucking bonkers. Sounds like a completely fucking terrible book. If you want to get into why Mexico is poorer than the US, for one, there's more people in Mexico, or there was more people in Mexico because Spanish colonialism killed and expelled fewer people. So wealth was distributed among more people, right? Like, this is something that a lot of people sort of gloss over in this why Latin America poorer discourse, is that obviously when you're distributing land between fewer people, those fewer people are going to be richer. And how was the land distributed between fewer people? Well, because they killed and excluded more of them. There's also the fact that the US completely fucking destroyed Mexico, stealing literally half the country. So perhaps that is a reason? Perhaps that is related? something similar, not precisely with the annexation, but with the interference and attacks on their country goes for every single other country in Latin America being attacked by the US. So perhaps that has something to do with it? Or I guess not. I guess this thing I read in a book once that is nonsensical is actually the reason.
This will prevent me from ever visiting Spain, but it's really more useful to the Spanish Empire as a midpoint between a Muslim empire like, say, the Ottomans, and a country like France. That honestly does make sense, given that the most civilized and developed parts of Spain, and the parts most involved in the colonization of the
civilized and developed?
New World, were heavily culturally Arab and Muslim, not that long before the colonization of the New World started. The Spanish imperial model was basically exactly the same as the Ottoman, with a colonial warrior noble class ruling over the empire with a unified crusading religion as the source of political
colonial warrior noble class? I mean, no, not at all. Like, the whole conquistador thing, that happened for like 50 years, man. Things settled down after that. The Spanish Empire was not ruled by a warrior noble class. The Spanish Empire was ruled by fat men living on slave plantations who never worked it for themselves a day in their life.
Legitimacy and a large centralized absolutist monarchy. The native populations were stripped of leadership while the market economy and science were distrusted, and attacks on religious authority brutally crushed. But back to the main point that I teased. The Spanish were...
How do you respond to someone who doesn't provide any examples or justifications for the shit they're saying? This is the problem with the vast majority of history YouTubers. They just say shit and they don't justify it. So you can't, like, they don't really leave you with an avenue for refuting their claims. Aside from you yourself writing like a fucking 200-page long thesis on the general topic, explaining precisely how they are wrong while going through an exhaustive list of examples when they never even provided one. It's incredible.
Trying very hard to model the Roman Empire and succeeded in a lot of ways. The biggest similarity is that both...
Ethnic map of Hispanic America in 1700. Wow, this is fucking... Brazil is African American? African American? The ethnic group African American that only exists in the USA. Brazil is African American, guys. So is Venezuela, and also I guess like half of Venezuela / Colombia is also Spanish. Haiti is marked as African American as well. This has to be taken from a video game or something.
Both used culturally coherent aristocracies to dominate diverse and large regions. A Quechua Indian peasant in the Peruvian Andes shared nothing with a cowboy in Argentina or a Congo-speaking slave in Cuba, but their landlords shared a culture that became Latin America. A wealthy person from Mexico City could immigrate more...
That's not how it works. Like, the culture of the majority is not so simply dictated by the dictates of a numerically tiny elite. That's not how it works. That's precisely why throughout Latin American history, this numerically tiny elite have fucking hated the culture of the majority and done everything possible to erase it to absolutely no avail whatsoever. They've failed completely and massively.
More than 1,000 miles to Lima and experienced the exact same culture. This was very different from the British colonies in which a trip 500
and experience the exact same culture. No, you couldn't.
Miles north from Baltimore.
Look, we have the crafty peasants, the hill tribes, and the land and surf-hungry lords, along with the cultists. Dude, these are like fucking... These are like faction names from a fucking video game. Holy shit.
Baltimore to Boston would take one an entirely different economic, social, religious model. Until
okay, I gotta fucking speed this up to get through this fucking guy just saying random shit fast.
Until the revolution, the British colonies distrusted each other more than their mother country. The Spanish were trying very hard to imitate the Roman Empire of around 100 AD at its height, but instead ended up pretty similarly to how the Roman Empire worked around 400 with Diocletian and
oh my god.
In both of these states, the centralized government was trying too hard to maintain more power over a region than really made sense. Both states were trying to get Stalin levels of control over their countries when transportation was being done by mule. This resulted in sclerotic bureaucracies which passed lots of legislation that they really couldn't enforce. The Spanish crown sent around 500,000 edicts to America during the colonial era, most of which were irrelevant, didn't work with local conditions, and then ended up being condensed to around 7,000 laws that made sense. Spanish America had really complex legal codes, which were in fact so complicated that they were only enforced in the breach rather than to the letter, since that would have just been impossible.
No, I mean, of course, the reason why they weren't enforced was because it was convenient to ignore the laws. I mean, laws, especially historical laws, are generally just for show. They don't actually matter. You know, they're not meant to be enforced in any way, shape, or form. That's why they were just ignored incredibly often. Like the only laws that the fucking Spanish crown actually gave a shit about were the ones that benefited themselves, and you fucking bet they would make sure they were enforced.
This is effects even today, with Latin America known for being one of the most bureaucratic and red tape-based parts of the world, which hurts business terribly.
Oh, you wouldn't want to hurt business, right? Says American. You wouldn't want to hurt our ability to establish dominance over all your resources and hurt business. And the reason for that isn't because, you are following the exact same path or trying to follow the exact same path of development that every single country in the world, including the USA, followed in terms of using protectionism to develop an industrial sector before finally opening things up a bit once you are able to actually compete in the international market. No. You're not allowed to do that because it hurts the business of the countries that have already done that. The classic American...
Spanish crown would send viceroys to the disparate parts of the empire and have them rule like kings for a couple years. In order to prevent the provinces from becoming too independent of the Spanish crown, none of the top positions were allowed to native-born whites, with those top positions being controlled by Spaniards from Spain itself. The second someone was born in America, they became a literal second-class citizen. The Spaniards created a system of...
Does not being able to be the president or the head of a region mean that you're a second-class citizen, even though economically, materially, socially, politically, in every single level, way, shape, or form, you're at the top of society? No.
Forced labor and servitude in which Indians and blacks had to work for Spanish nobility. This was pretty similar to Diocletian's Rome, in which a government-based serf economy resulted in profound inequality, a strangling of the market economy, and declining population.
Strangling of the market economy and declining population. What the fuck is this? This is like a Jordan Peterson diagram. Look at this, folks. I'm gonna just write a bunch of random shit, draw some arrows to them, and put them on the screen. How about that? I don't know if I can finish this. This is insane.
And growth, as so much was extracted from the population that there weren't enough resources for people to have lots of kids. Spanish America expanded really quickly.
So much was extracted from the population that there weren't enough resources to have lots of kids. There's a very relevant example that disproves this claim. Slavery in the USA, they literally bred slaves like they were cattle. The vast majority of the slaves in the US were not shipped there, they were born there. So if in those conditions there's literal slaves, they had plenty enough kids to maintain the slave population. I am 100% sure people in serfdom still would have had lots of kids.
And then faced economic and demographic decay. The borders of Spanish America were roughly the same in 1590 as 1790, and the population of Mexico in 1700 was 4.5 million, or a quarter of what it was under the Aztecs. For example, the little more than a million or so people who immigrated to America in the colonial era bred like crazy and had a population of 10 million in 1820.
No, that's not what happened. They didn't breed like crazy. There was mass immigration.
Bred like crazy and had a population of 10 million in 1820. A key point is that Spanish America, like Spain before it, was an urban civilization, unlike British North America that was rural. A couple Spanish...
That's just not true.
Landlords would live in the city, extracting resources from the white, black, or native...
Most of the Spanish landlords had their own home estates as well where they lived. They lived on things called haciendas. I mean, this is so fucking basic that you could just Google it. It's probably the first result. Come on, dude.
Serfs around them. Speaking to other elites, well, they shared practically...
The urban centers were the centers of, the administration, not so much of the economic landholding elite.
Nothing with their serfs, and so the society...
Why would they choose to live in, a shit-filled sewer city rather than their own luxurious mansion on a massive estate? That doesn't make any sense.
Itself is fairly weak. Something you really need to understand about Latin America is that it, alongside India, are the most multiracial and also ethnically diverse of the main civilizations. In Latin America, a white
main civilization
class installed itself, and then a complex caste system developed with different ethnicities performing different roles.
This caste system was never functionally, it was never implemented. These paintings, like a cultural artifact of the 19th century emerging petit bourgeois who just created a ridiculous romanticized version of the people they saw around them. Very few of these terms were ever actually used administratively. This just never happened. There was not an incredibly complex caste system. The racial system in the Spanish colonies was practically the exact same as that in the US. You were either native, black, or Spanish / white. That was all. I mean, I went over this in my video on how race was invented, if you want to check that out, but this is just completely wrong. I'm pretty sure the Wikipedia page on this goes over this. It also refers to a now discredited 20th century theoretical framework, which postulated that Spanish colonial society operated under a hierarchical race-based caste system. Well, I mean, it did, but not like this. No, not even remotely this complicated.
In society. In Venezuela, for example, the Castilian Spanish were the ruling class, the native-born whites controlled a lot of the economic power, people from the Canary Islands were the merchants and artisans, the herders were mixed-race white, black, native, blacks worked in the plantations, and either mixed-race or full-blood natives were serfs. I think
it's just kind of weird to sort of frame this as something unique to the Spanish when, as we all know, the racial society in the US was even stronger and deeply more entrenched, and racial restrictions, or aka caste restrictions, because in this case this is really what caste means, lasted in far longer. Formal laws and shit related to it lasted far longer.
The most important element for a society's success is social cohesion, and that people trust that the other elements of the society are trying
his proof that there is apparently less social cohesion in Latin America is a survey on the This website, Our World in Data. Dude, I gotta tell you, like, if Americans think they can trust each other more than people in other societies, God, they have another thing fucking coming. All it really means is that in the USA, like, class divides are better hidden, or like people are more like more docile, and obviously they are, because they are bribed with the super profits that they extract from imperialism, and they eat MSG burger and take Prozac.
Best that the rulers aren't cheating the people and other groups aren't free riding. Japan and America are both very successful societies that share practically nothing in common except social cohesion. Latin America, meanwhile, is one of the regions in the world that scores lowest on this metric, with
the USA
Latin Americans not trusting their governments.
Social cohesion, and his metric for social cohesion is like one random poll that was apparently carried out, who fucking knows, that ranks the USA slightly above Argentina.
Japan and America.
Okay.
Latin America, meanwhile, is one of the regions in the world that scores lowest on this metric, with Latin Americans not trusting their governments or even neighbors at all. This was
Source: a random picture of a guy being put into the back of a patrol van.
Or even neighbors at all. This was accentuated by having different races living together, providing different roles, while having a literal parasitic ruling class and a docile...
Is he like trying to say that having like more races is worse? It really sounds like what he was saying there.
Peasant class, completely alienated from the modern world. This will have profound effects on the society.
Completely alienated from the modern world? Oh my god.
Just later. A big factor for Latin America is the peasantry and lower classes were basically not represented at all in the social structure. There was no system of accountability and feedback loop between the lower...
Were black people in the US? No.
And upper classes, which turned Latin America into a profoundly aristocratic society. I was once reading a book written in the 1940s which said that your average mid-level Brazilian city would have an opera house and no functioning sewer system, and your average American city would be the opposite. Brazil's sort of...
I mean, your average American city existed to funnel workers to factories. That is why American cities cropped up.
Sort of a weird twisted mirror to all of this, where...
It's always weird how he's always like, I once read this book written in the 1940s or whatever. It said this thing... No justification, no evidence. I'm not even going to tell you which book it was. I don't even know which book it was. It might have come to me in a dream, but I'm just going to tell you that. That's like the closest that he's come to citing anything in the entire video is I once read a book that said this incredibly broad general thing that may or may not even be true. I'm not going to look into it though.
The Portuguese government was way more lax than the Spanish, but it did have a lot of similar policies. The Portuguese government banned the printing press, set up massive aristocratic plantations where people brought slaves in to create a complex white-black...
It was way more lax, and then he goes on to say that they did the same thing.
...caste system. At the same time, the Portuguese didn't have as strong a hand as the Spanish did, but you see similar aristocratic results appearing in Brazil as in the rest of Latin America. A lot of this just...
I mean, far more, on average, of the Brazil's population was enslaved, so I don't know how they didn't have as strong of a hand.
This comes from the economics of sugar slavery.
I have my handy dandy chart. I have some fucking arrows. Jesus Christ.
Which creates similar
This guy is like the Jordan Peterson of awful YouTube videos.
Results to what happened in Latin America. I mean, look at the Roman Empire, which, as it got higher and higher percentages of slaves, became more similar to how Latin America developed. Two of the most brutal things I ever read in history books were both about Mexican history. The first was...
I read this in a book. I'm not going to tell you which, though. He does this like a million times.
Mexico was one of the few nations that when it was born, you couldn't tell if it was an abortion or not. And the other was
By this time, he actually cites the books. You couldn't tell if it was an abortion or not. Whoever wrote that, you know, I think they might be a bit stupid, and you might be a bit stupid to cite that.
Mexico is an epilogue to the Spanish Empire. Confused? Let me explain. As I tried to explain before, the Spanish government set up Latin America in order for them to administer it directly, and so that the colonies could not act independently. This meant that when the Spanish colonies did get independence, they continually floundered about and failed to act independently of the Spanish crown. When Spain was...
How would that work? So they broke away from Spain so they could act independently, and then they just decided not to, I guess?
Was invaded by France during the Napoleonic Wars around 1810, each of the Spanish-American colonies collapsed into what amounted to civil wars. People often talk about wars of liberation, but they were really normally just brutal race and class wars as the fabric of society fell apart with one local faction supporting the Spanish and the other independents. For example, about 25,000 people died in the American Revolution, while 400,000 died in the Mexican, but both countries had roughly similar populations.
I mean, the Mexican Revolution was not only far longer, and not only were there multiple, you know, with different aims between them, the US Revolution was essentially just a conflict between white landowners, whereas the Mexican Revolution, or revolutions, were actually revolutions where oppressed, you know, not particularly white people had a stake in things. So quite different conflicts there. You know, like there is a reason why, for example, in the Mexican Revolution, most native peoples or mixed race peoples fought against the Spanish crown, whereas during the American Revolution, it was literally the exact opposite. Because the American, you know, independence heroes, as they like to frame them, were such like brutal genocidal maniacs that you know, the vast majority of Native American peoples recognize them as being even worse for them than British rule was. It's weird how like the Americans framed their War of Independence as a revolution, because it certainly was not one. It didn't fundamentally change the structure of society. It just put new people on top. Anyway, let's get this over with.
This was since the collapse of Spanish power resulted in the collapse in society in Mexico, while the collapse of British power in America was just normal business.
The collapse of... I mean, it's incredible how, like, even if this was true, which it's not, because obviously the collapse of Spanish rule did not result in the collapse of society, but, like, it was just normal business, right? Like, barely anything changed. Isn't that like an indication to you that it wasn't actually a revolution at all? Put two and two together here. Like, connect a fucking neuron in your brain, dude.
Afterwards, the Latin American nations formed under caudillos or independent cults of personality as their government. These people would normally form factions to back them, often interestingly enough pulling from herding tribes as their followers, and then launch themselves into power for a few years.
Pulling from herding tribes? Did he just say herding tribes?
This was since the collapse of Spanish power in Mexico, while the collapse of British power in America was just normal business. Afterwards, the Latin American nations formed under caudillos or independent cults of personality as their government. These people would normally form factions to back them, often interestingly enough pulling from herding tribes as their followers.
Herding tribes? What the fuck is that? Dude, what the hell is he talking about? And it's weird how, like, apparently the evil Mexicans had the dictators, the cults of personality. Not to mention how many of them were backed by the US. So the situations that caused their rise was a direct result of US or European interference. But like, have you heard of like the USA, dude? Like the literal religious worship of the founding fathers and like other such political figures and their ideologies.
And then launch themselves into power for a few years until the next dictatorship would gain power. After a couple decades, the countries furthest from the equator pulled themselves out into coherent centralized states, independent from these leaders' personalities. Latin America has always not been very stable, and so political fascists elsewhere manifest really strongly in Latin America, since the aristocratic culture allows cults of personality to manifest really strongly. Political fascists gained currency for a couple decades, allowing some Chad to gain power for...
Did you just say like political fascism or factionalism?
Aristocratic culture allows cults of personality to manifest really strongly. Political fashions gain currency for a couple decades, allowing some Chad to gain power for him and his buddies, and then another faction sweeps over the region when he can't make real long-term change. From 1850 to 1920-ish, republics of white landowners with voters rarely numbering over 10% of the population dominated the region. From 1920 to 1960, the area was dominated by dictatorial nationalist technocracies that were a weird mix of right and left-wing policies. Military...
Dude, I wish that I had the confidence to just rattle off this shit without feeling any need to justify it.
Dictatorships competed with communists and almost always won from 1960 to 1980. Liberal democracies gained power from 1980 to 2000, followed by a shift to left-wing governments until around 2016.
Liberal democracies and then leftist democracies? Apparently, like, there was some sort of fundamental change because there were, like, elections of some people who, like, implemented, like, $50 welfare stipends for mothers with children, I guess. Just a fundamental change.
Shifting back to further right governments. It would be an exaggeration to say these ideologies don't matter. The countries that supported neoliberalism ended up far better than those that went for communism, for example, but...
All the top countries are neoliberal. And which one does he have marked as neoliberal? Well, in this one, Uruguay is first. And Uruguay's primary growth in the last 20 years or so was experienced under the Frente Amplio government, so I'm not sure how that counts as like neoliberal. The second one on this graph, let's check out the colors, is Argentina, which he also points to as a top neoliberal country, which also experienced its main period of growth, actually the one that this massive shoot up that you see here, under a government that I'm pretty sure this guy would think is communist. This orange one is Trinidad and Tobago, which I don't know enough about to comment on, but I'm pretty sure at this point, after those last two, we can safely say this guy just made arrows, pointed to those, and just hope that no one would look at what he's saying. Like, what the fuck, man?
Those that went for communism, for example, but it wouldn't be a horrific exaggeration.
Like, this is just measuring growth, right? Like, all that matters is growth. All that matters is how useful a country is to corporate profits. That's all that matters, right? Just look at the growth graph.
For example, in both 1900 and today, the average Latin American had 1/4 of the GDP of your average American. The region has been moving forward in the last few decades, forming a real middle class in large cities, for example, but the whole world has also been moving forward really fast, meaning that Latin America has been running very fast to stay in the same spot in relative power in the world stage as it's ever been. In fact, the rise of Eastern Europe and East Asia makes Latin America look downright pathetic and embarrassing. Latin America...
How? What the fuck was that? The rise of Eastern Europe. God, I'd like to show this guy Eastern Europe, man.
Clearly has problems. Anyone, especially Latin Americans, realize that. They wouldn't be migrating to the US or Spain in the tens of millions if that wasn't the case. Countries like Brazil and Mexico have more annual gun deaths.
Like, it's kind of weird, like, the way these people look at migration, it's like a proof that, like, we are better. rather than maybe it's a proof that you are exploiting the places that they are from, that you are constantly destabilizing and pretty much doing everything you possibly can to destroy them. Like, do you think that people migrate from Mexico, Guatemala, etc., to the US, a country that literally stole half of Mexico's territory in wars of conquest, and that has done pretty much everything they possibly can to ensure the country stays poor since then? Do you think that's like proof of like the US being morally and superior, that system being better or whatever? Or is it proof that the US has taken from these countries to enrich itself, which obviously is naturally going to result in people wanting to go where their stolen wealth was taken? That kind of makes a lot of sense. Like, it's like looking at, for example, like the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, which caused tons of refugees emanating from Iraq and Afghanistan who wanted to go to Europe, and then being like, oh, they're coming here because we're better, and ignoring the fact that you destroyed their countries. Maybe that's also why they want to go there.
Deaths due to crime than deaths in actual war zones like Syria or Iraq. Many Latin American countries like Brazil or Venezuela are in the worst economic conditions in their entire recorded histories now, with millions of the global middle class.
Brazil is in the worst economic conditions in its entire recorded history? I don't even know how to respond to that one.
Slinking back into poverty. Why, however? This is a question with really painful answers that people generally don't want to have be answered. The answers that get proposed are generally just demonstrative of what's self-aggrandizing. I will try my best to debunk some of the bad ones and try to propose some better answers. One of the arguments you hear coming out of the right is that there's something inherently wrong with Hispanic culture, that it's too collectivist, Catholic, etc. This is clearly false, given that firstly Spain did quite well.
Does the right think it's too Catholic? That must be like some specific argument being held by like esoteric Hitlerites on Twitter or something. I've never heard that in my life. I'm pretty sure the right fucking loves the fact that Latin America is religious.
Once it integrated into the European Union, and that Hispanics have done well inside the US. Miami in real terms is culturally part of Latin America, as is the Mexican borderland, and both are quite prosperous. Similarly, you still hear what amounts to the racist argument that Latin America isn't successful since it's brown. This ignores the immense diversity in Latin America. Argentina and Uruguay are whiter than the US and Canada. There also really isn't a correlation for success and skin tone in Latin America. The Argentines in real terms are just as poor as their neighbors who are dark-skinned, and are far worse off than mixed-race Chile. Among immigrant groups in America, the largely white Puerto Ricans are
Latin American medium income by national origin. What the fuck am I looking at, man?
poorer than other darker-skinned groups like the Mexicans. You get the geography argument, which has some validity in that Latin America has had horrific diseases for a lot of its history, massive deserts and jungles. However, you also get Latin American countries like Argentina that have what amounts to a perfect climate, some of the best soil in the world, and a big river system, and they still failed. Also, America was able
to... They failed? How? What does failure mean? Failed at what?
To get around the South's disease problems, the deserts of the West, and difficulty farming the Great Plains through technological advance. Latin America could have done something similar if it was a more technologically developed culture. You also hear the argument in the left that Latin America is held back by colonialism and a part of either Europe or America. On the surface level, this does make sense given how Latin America has been economically dependent on other regions, namely Britain before World War I and America since. However, upon scrutiny, it just doesn't hold up. Firstly,
How not?
When you actually read the history involved, the local elites often welcomed colonial systems. Bolivar was practically simping for the British, for example. Latin America sells raw goods to the rest
of
the global market, and exchange gets produced goods. There isn't anything oppressive about it.
I mean, that very system that you just cited, like being dependent on selling primary products and using that to buy the finished product, that literally is like the main problem facing the vast majority of poor countries in the world. That their ability to industrialize has been intentionally attacked and stunted by the richer countries to keep them exporting these primary products with the helpful collaboration of the local aristocracies. So it doesn't, like, the argument doesn't hold up, apparently, right? When these countries tried to industrialize, and in response, the USA couped them and installed fascist military governments that proceeded to massacre anyone who supported like the most basic social welfare programs and industrialization. According to him, it doesn't hold up when he just literally cited the main reason, the main fucking problem, which is dependency on primary production, a dependency that has been imposed by the local elites and allied, especially with the US, also with Europe, but mainly the US, who have done everything possible to keep their country's economies dependent on primary production rather than on much more valuable, improved production. Like, how did the USA get rich? It certainly wasn't through exporting primary production. It was by industrializing, by making improved products. You debunked yourself there. If you think about it for 2 fucking seconds.
All the partners are voluntary. Almost every economy
ever. All the partners are voluntary? It's voluntary? You think that everyone was just everyone in this country just got together and said, yeah, dude, we're gonna export cows to the US for the rest of our existence because that's the best way to do things. It's voluntary to you? No, the entire reason why, for example, Argentina relies so much on agricultural production is because throughout the 20th century, the aristocrats with their British and then US allies, did every fucking thing possible to destroy any attempt to industrialize the country and to keep it reliant on their primary production because that's what was most beneficial for them. And the USA was so fucking happy to oblige. Under the US-backed dictatorship in Argentina from 76 to 83, the country was deindustrialized at breakneck fucking speeds. I'm pretty sure it was the worst deindustrialization in the history of the fucking world. And with the governments that this guy would probably cite as the reason for Latin America being poor, there were the fastest periods of industrialization in all of these countries' histories. It's just an incoherent argument made by someone who wants to apologize for and justify imperialism with it's all consensual, bro. You could make a fucking meme here I consent with the flag of the US on it. I consent with some white fucking aristocrat. And then everyone else in the country being isn't there someone you forgot to ask? Except in this case, the meme isn't ironic because it's fucking true. Jesus Christ.
With selling raw goods in exchange for produced ones with a more developed economy, but Latin America never progressed beyond it for centuries. The argument generally goes that if an American
never progressed beyond it for centuries. Wow, I wonder why.
Company would be mining copper in Bolivia, that it would be oppressing Bolivia, but if the Americans weren't there, the copper would never be mined in the first place, making everyone poorer.
Bolivian copper is mined by Bolivian state companies. What the fuck are you talking about? It's not difficult to extract copper.
Studies have found that greater trade with America and Europe and China actually results in more wealth, not less. The drug trade is a critical...
This guy, he's trying to deal with very complicated economic, socioeconomic and political arguments and just try to dismiss them offhandedly by, whining about oppression or something.
Exception to this, in which the massive desire for drugs coming out of the US destroyed practically every Latin country within 2,000 miles.
The massive desire for these primary products in Latin America and as a whole is what has destroyed these countries too. It's not just drugs.
However, to also be fair, if Latin America was already functioning, they'd be able to control the drug trade to a greater degree than they did. The British generally left Latin America alone politically, while the Americans launched a couple pinprick strikes in the Caribbean.
The British literally invaded Latin America multiple times.
And basin. The CIA gets way more credit than it deserves in Latin America. The destruction of leftists in places like El Salvador, Chile, and Argentina, for example, was almost entirely locally organized, and the US just watched. The US...
What? The US just watched?
does relatively little in Latin America, especially south of the Caribbean basin.
The US does relatively little in Latin America? Dude, he is fucking stoned. He is stoned as fuck. Holy shit.
Doesn't care, although it does pick factions it wants to win.
The US doesn't care? The US doesn't care? The US doesn't care so much that it literally created a doctrine saying we have the exclusive right to interfere in Latin America. It doesn't care so much.
Atrocious blunders such as the 1952 coup in Guatemala that removed a democratic reforming government and a 1916 invasion of the Dominican Republic, but there are other points where the US should have intervened and didn't. Haitians, for example, begrudged the US in the 1970s for not removing their tyrannical Papa Doc, and I'm betting most citizens in Cuba and Venezuela would have preferred the US to have a stronger hand. The US has more leniency in Latin America than many people care to admit. America, for example, let Mexico liquidate the American oil company in Mexico in the 1930s without raising a hand. America also wanted Castro.
He just wrote, the majority of oppressive American actions in Latin America were stopped in 1920. Unfucking believable. This is torture.
And allowed him to seize power in his early phases for hope that he'd reform the country until he became communist and anti-American. The myth that their problems are due to foreign exploitation is very powerful in Latin America and does immense harm. Any failed Latin American dictator will just blame their problems on the US or the West to remove responsibility from themselves.
It's funny how, you can blame these problems on the US with actual, endless troves of material evidence, and this guy can just discount it offhandedly by just saying whatever he wants. And it's so funny how, for him, industrialization is a regressive economic measure. He's just he spent half the video talking about how bad the aristocracy is, and then he's just anyone who tries to combat the aristocracy is bad, actually. Amazing. Apparently the way to achieve growth is just to sell, grain, cattle, and coffee until the end of time. This is incredible.
Latin America has wasted literal decades blaming America on their poverty, which just mires them in further poverty. The idea that their poverty comes from
literally decades fighting against fucking the USA. It's unbelievable.
Is a way of reconciling that many Latin Americans are taught that their nations are rich due to mineral wealth, but that they live poor lives. The truth, however, is that wealth is practically nothing.
Okay, we can give you a counterfactual to this. Bolivia installs a left-wing government after literally 50 years of economic stagnation at the hand of American-backed free market capitalist / neoliberal dictatorships. What happens? Well, they nationalize, for example, the huge parts of the mining industry and the natural gas industry, and experience by far the fastest period of economic growth and rising living standards in the country's history in just 10 years. So looks like the counter thesis to your claims is pretty fucking massive here, my friend. And the same has been true in pretty much all across Latin America, that once the American desired dependency is combated, things get better. Wow, who would have fucking thought?
Nothing to do with resources. As Switzerland and Japan being wealthy with practically nothing, and Nigeria and Brazil with massive resources being poor shows us. The truth is that
Switzerland and Japan, luckily, were not invaded, couped, interfered in by the USA in collaboration with local landowning aristocrats left over from the Spanish Empire. luckily. And Japan's like path to development was literally incredibly protectionist. It involved a fucking ton of like government interference in the economy. Exactly what Latin America tried to do.
Latin America's poor since there isn't a division between legal, political, and economic power. When the Iberian conquerors came in, they structured every...
Is there a division between legal, economic, and political power in the US? No, obviously not. In the US, corruption is literally just plain legal.
Everything on an aristocratic basis, concentrating economic power in the hands of the landlords and judicial and political in the hands of the Spaniards who recently came over, who, when the Spanish monarchy fell apart, defaulted onto the landlords. This lack of balance of power has allowed a profound sense of corruption and distrust to permeate Latin America.
God, like the corruption narrative comes from Americans who have the most corrupt political system in the entire fucking world, where everything is dictated by the power of corporations. But they made large parts of it legal, ergo they are not corrupt. Like for an American, it's worse like if some random politician like accepts a $30,000 like Volkswagen Golf as a bribe than it is for like oil executives to like advocate for like massive reforms that would massively benefit the oil industry at the expense of everyone else, for example. It's okay if it's legal, basically. Whereas if it's illegal and relatively inconsequential, that's when it's the worst.
Isn't any competition to behave better. Once power is centralized to this degree, anyone who really tries to change the system gets crushed behind the force of entropy and various weird special interests that don't want...
Instability versus independence? How the fuck do you measure these things? What the fuck is this? What is the source for this? Oh my god, this is...
things to change.
You might as well make a graph measuring good versus bad.
The powerful have no interest in not being corrupt, and so the system rots inside. Revolutions have failed to reach their stated goals in Latin America, since generally what happens is that the revolutionaries just fill the shoes of the pre-existing oppressors and change the name since it's so easy and profitable.
What? And his example for this is a picture of the Cuban flag. So the Cuban state is structured the same as Batista's capitalist agricultural slave empire, apparently. Holy shit, this is incredible.
Revolutions that claim to be wiping out the landlords frankly just became new landlords. It's interesting given that the American stereotype went from the lazy Mexican for when Mexicans were in Mexico to Mexicans being really hardworking and stealing American jobs in America. In Mexico, one wouldn't work hard since one wasn't incentivized to, since the landlord would just steal it.
You've lived in Mexico? Wow, we need to fucking send out a fucking red notice for you. Interpol red notice. Get this guy. Anyway, yeah, I'm kind of tired about this. I'm tired of this already. This is fucking... This guy's on... He's on something.
Some countries...
It's not really surprising to me that he ended up getting to, like, making videos complaining about how he can't get a girlfriend.